So in our final module, we're going to be looking at Penelope. And if Helen is the major woman in the Iliad that we're all thinking about, then Penelope has to be the key woman among many women, one must say, in the Odyssey. Now, the Odyssey has often been noted as an epic that has a lot of women in it. We've also already mentioned Helen, we've had Clytemnestra, Calypso, Circe, Nausicaa, and in fact this has led to some theories that the Odyssey was in fact written by a woman. This was theorised by Samuel Butler in 1897, his authoress of the Odyssey. But not many people have gone down that line, and I think it's more interesting to think about what the role of women is in this epic and how they kind of interplay with the themes around Odysseus. So Penelope is of course particularly important because the major theme of the Odyssey is Odysseus' return, his nostos. And that really does mean not just getting back to Ithaca, it means getting back to his oikos, his home, his household. And as we saw before, the household is really more than just the physical space of the home. It is the wife, the family, the slaves, and all of the belongings that belong with it. So Penelope really represents that, and her fidelity is incredibly important for maintaining the stability of that oikos. So for him to be able to return home to a functioning oikos, Penelope needs to be there and she needs to be faithful. There's also an interesting comparison throughout the Odyssey between Odysseus and Penelope. So at one point, Odysseus talks about the homophrosyne, which means the same thinkingness between husband and wife. And they're often described in similar ways, where Odysseus is described as being cunning. His epithet polymetes, super cunning, is often compared to Penelope's periphron, which means sort of thinking around things, although sometimes it's translated as prudent, which isn't quite so good. But she's cunning, right? We've got the example of her weaving her web, weaving and unweaving to delay the suitors, and that's very much something that Odysseus would do. So that similarity between the two of them is part of what constructs their characters. And again, she's also important on her own terms. So in her reception, in the subsequent discussions of Penelope, she's often been taken as the sort of cowed, obedient, faithful wife. But there's actually a really interesting ambiguity to her presentation within the Odyssey that I think if you read a little bit deeper, you can see that there's a lot more going on to her character and that she might not be quite as simple as she first seems. So the big question in terms of this ambiguity is, when does she recognise Odysseus? And if she does recognise him, at what point does that happen? So why does she decide, at the very moment where Odysseus has returned, 20 years since he left, to set up a contest for her hand in marriage, with the stringing of the bow and the contest of shooting through the axes? And why does she set that up? If she knows that Odysseus is there, why doesn't she just recognise him? And if she hasn't recognised him, has she given up on him? And the bigger question is, has she really been faithful to him all this time? Of course, we should note that there are serious double standards going on here, because Odysseus sleeps with several different women on his return home, and yet Penelope is expected to be faithful. But as we discussed in an earlier module, that's obviously important for a woman because it's all about ensuring the legitimacy of the offspring, particularly the male offspring and the heirs. So we see a tension in Penelope's actions and speech in the Odyssey, where at times she seems to recognise the beggar as Odysseus. So there's one point in book 19 where she's talking to Odysseus disguised as a beggar, and she comments on the fact that he's very similar to Odysseus. So does that mean that she recognises him? She also insists on him participating in the bow contest, which suggests that she has kind of some idea that what's going on. Otherwise, why would you ask a raggedy old beggar to participate in a contest for your hand? But at other times, she seems really unaware that Odysseus has come back. She, for example, asks him to interpret a dream that she's had that is demonstrating through kind of allegory that Odysseus will return. And Odysseus says, yes, Odysseus is coming back. And she says, well, I don't believe you. So there are these moments where she seems not to agree with Odysseus, not to recognise him. So the problem is that we can't really tell what Penelope is thinking because her voice and her actions aren't being privileged. As we saw, she's constantly being sent back to her room, she's constantly being silenced, she spends most of the epic weeping, in tears, weaving, and so we really don't see what's going on behind her. So how do we interpret Penelope? And this has been a big question for scholars, and there have been a couple of different approaches that I will introduce for you. So the traditional interpretation has been that Penelope recognises Odysseus when the poet tells us that she recognises him, that is in book 23 of the Odyssey, after she's set the test of the bed, and then Odysseus reveals himself as having built the bed, she recognises him, and that is where it happens. Some other scholars have looked to the tradition, the transmission of the poems and their construction, and have thought about the fact that there may be different poems here, different angles, different poems being stitched together, and that might be a reason why Penelope seems inconsistent. So at one point she looks like she recognises him, at another she doesn't, and that's because there were several different versions of this story being told. They were stitched together, and that's why it looks inconsistent. There are other scholars who suggest that in fact Penelope does recognise Odysseus earlier, and she pretends not to recognise him in order to increase his honour and status by having that big reveal scene where he strings the bow and then shoots the arrow through the axes, and so that's kind of purposeful, that she's again demonstrating her cunning and working together with Odysseus. Some scholars have looked at it from a psychological angle, so they've tried to think about, well, maybe this is what recognition looks like. Remember that her husband has been away for 20 years and she's kind of struggling with him being back again, and so maybe these are kind of different stages of recognition. And then finally, scholars have looked at it from a sort of indeterminate point of view, where they've been looking at how these different angles represent different plots, different social roles perhaps. Penelope sort of keeping her options open, not knowing whether Odysseus is coming home or not, and that indeterminacy is really important to her characterisation. So there are a lot of different ways of looking at Penelope, and you can sort of settle on one or more of them. I think ultimately, what's interesting is that, of course, she does recognise Odysseus in Book 23, but that recognition is incredibly drawn out, and it's the way that it's drawn out that makes us think about her agency in the process of recognition, right? Penelope is crucial in giving Odysseus his place back in the household. And we should also remember that it is his nurse, Eurycleia, who is the first person to recognise him of her own accord without him revealing himself. So it makes us think about the ways that women have actually a really important role in the household in bolstering and creating a role for men in supporting them. Penelope also is important in that she shows us a different example of a relationship between husband and wife. So we've also already seen that kind of uneasy relationship between Helen and Menelaus. We've seen the relationship between Andromache and Hector in the Iliad, where Andromache is kind of sent back home. We see Briseis and Achilles, a very different relationship where Briseis is a captive woman. And then, of course, we've seen all of Odysseus's casual relationships with goddesses that he undertakes throughout the epic versus the relationship that he has with Penelope after their recognition. So, in a way, the characterisation of Penelope not only reflects on themes of kind of the broader characterisation of women in Homeric epic, it also makes us think about how Penelope and Odysseus reflect and refract off each other in their cunning. And I think that's a really nice way of thinking about it, that long recognition is Penelope kind of engaging in her cunning in a very similar way to the ways that Odysseus often tells those lies, right, those Cretan tales. He often tells those lies, and she's also kind of making sure that she has her strategy always close to her chest. So ultimately, to me, I think that is the power of thinking about women in Homer. It asks us to see the story from a different perspective. When we look at it from Penelope's perspective, we see the Odyssey in a different way. We see her priorities in a different way. It makes us think about how characters play against each other and pair off. We've seen, for example, Helen, Clytemnestra and Penelope all pairing against each other in different ways between women. But we've also seen between men and women. We've seen how Odysseus and Penelope are paired together through their homophrosyna, and how Helen and Achilles are set against each other. It invites us to look into themes like the telling of stories, into glory, war and peace, and the ways that those kind of different worlds conflict against each other. And it also, and I think perhaps this is the most important thing, it continuously invites us to investigate gender roles, to question them in interesting ways. The interplay between, for example, Helen, who's seen as a woman, but she's weaving, and so then she's associated with the bard, and those gender roles are constantly being questioned and brought into play in new and interesting ways. And I think that that's something that Homer continuously invites us back to ask. Why do women matter? What are their roles? And why should we keep thinking about them today?